It's time for the 1430 Connection on 1430 WNAV and 99.9 FM, spotlighting news, newsmakers, and important community issues. Now, with this week's edition of the 1430 Connection, here is WNAV news anchor Donna Cole.
Welcome to the 1430 Connection. I'm Donna Cole. In the studio with me is Dr. Catherine Tully. She's an Assistant Professor of Agroecology in the Department of Plant Science and Landscape Architecture at the University of Maryland. Kate, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Agroecology, that's a big field that I didn't even know existed, but I've heard a lot about you, and I've heard what you're doing on the Eastern Shore is going to help a lot of people. So tell me what agroecology is, how you got into this field, and why you could potentially be the savior of the Eastern Shore of Maryland.
That's a tall order. An agroecologist is somebody who looks at agricultural systems, farming systems, through the lens of ecology. So all of the theories about how species interact, how we can increase the functioning of our systems, providing more ecosystem services than just producing food, that's sort of in the framing of agroecology. So I kind of think of it as we started our agricultural systems just to produce food. That's the only service that we think that they provide, but they can provide a lot of other services like storing carbon or regulating our nutrient cycles. And so how do we manage them in such a way that they can do more for us than just produce food? That's agroecology.
Did you decide, like in kindergarten, I want to be an agroecologist? Like, how did this happen? Did you grow up on a farm?
So I grew up in California, and my dad is a scientist. And so actually at first I was like, I never want to be a scientist because I saw how hard my dad was working. But we had a huge garden. And in California, you can grow everything. So we grew a lot of our own food. We grew a lot of fruit trees. So we had peaches and pears and plums and cherry plums. And we just grew a ton of our own food. And I was always the one helping my dad. And I just really started to love this field of growing food and then also thinking about how you can do good for the environment. So that's how it started. And then eventually I went to grad school to do environmental science. Yeah. And I started working in tropical forests. So I was just going to do ecology.
Weren't you in Africa too?
I was after that. So I started, my first project was in Costa Rica because I grew up in California. So I grew up speaking Spanish. And I was like, I should use this language that I know how to speak. And I went to Costa Rica, and I first was just working in tropical forests, which is wonderful. But in Costa Rica, that's where we get a lot of our bananas, a lot of our pineapples come from Costa Rica. So I started,
a lot of great birds.
Yes, a lot of great birds. Yes. Oh, yeah. All the bird sounds. And I spent a lot of time sort of peeking into these other ecosystems, like going to the banana, going to Dole, and going to Chiquita. And that's when I sort of decided that what I wanted to do was study more of the agriculture side. And so I started working on coffee farms, actually, in Costa Rica.
From Costa Rica, how did you end up in Maryland?
So that's also kind of a funny story. So after that, I was hired by the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and I worked and lived in Kenya and Tanzania for about 3 years. And I, as a postdoc and then as a research scientist, and I was trying to figure out what my next move was going to be. And I actually applied for my Maryland job it was like a depot for sugar. It was the only place that had power. When the power would go down in Tanzania where I was living, like the whole town. So I would ride my little bike with my little bell, like ding, ding, like to the next town. And I would plug in I had a friend whose family owned the sugar depot. And so I finished my application to the University of Maryland from that sugar depot.
What a story.
And then I went back to Kenya, and I was living on a game, like a research preserve for large game and wild animals.
So who's going to play you in the movie?
I don't know. I have no idea. And I didn't know that I got the job until I had to take a bus, 45 minutes down to the town and then find the Wi-Fi on the one little internet cafe. And I was like, I got a job.
And here you are and doing some incredibly important work. We're going to take a short break on the 1430 Connection and hear more from Kate on what she's doing. Welcome back to the 1430 Connection. I'm Donna Cole. In the studio with me today is Dr. Kate Tully, an assistant professor of agroecology in the University of Maryland's Department of Plant Science and Landscape Architecture. Your current work, a lot of it takes place on the eastern shore of Maryland. You're researching saltwater intrusion, and that's the movement of salt water from the ocean into the land, specifically into farms. And salt isn't necessarily a good thing for our crops, yes?
No, it's not good.
Tell me about that.
Sure. So saltwater intrusion is the, as you said very eloquently, this sort of landward movement of sea salts. And most of the crops that we grow, all the crops that we grow on the eastern shore, the corn, soy, and wheat rotations that are very typical, are not adapted to high salinity environments. And so there are some crops that are more salt tolerant. Some of them are bred for salt tolerance, but for the most part, if you drive down to these fields, you'll see these salty rings actually around the edges of the fields, and that's because the ditch network. So we created all these ditches to drain the water off the field because we're so low lying on the eastern shore. It's like 2 feet above sea level. But unfortunately, now as the seas are, the sea is rising, and with our big king tides that we have, it actually can push the salt onto the farm fields, and then it kind of stays there and it doesn't drain off.
And for an understanding of this is happening on the entire eastern shore, not just in the areas close to the Atlantic, right?
It's happening all across. So there's areas in Delaware that are experiencing this, in Virginia, and then of course here on our side of the eastern shore.
But not just the coastal area. Like you see some of this in Queen Anne's County, along the Chesapeake Bay, right?
You can see, yes, of course. Yeah, you can see a lot of it in Caroline. You can see some of it in Caroline County as well. And then we see a lot of it in Dorchester and Somerset County, Talbot, of course, where we have the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. Right. And you see it in Wicomico. So all along the eastern shore and pretty far up as well.
20 years ago, this wouldn't have been studied, right?
I don't think it was in our minds 20 years ago.
But because of climate change, this is now a thing, and you were at the forefront of leading this. I was looking at this article in the Atlantic, and this is from, I think, last year, maybe? March 2nd, 2018. It says, on a windy, overcast October day, Karen Gadan from George Washington University and our colleague, Kate Tully, an agroecologist from the University of Maryland, are checking salinity levels at several of their 7 test sites in the region. Farmlands only a few feet above sea level. We knew this was an area where we were likely to see impact, says Gadan. Sea level rise near the Chesapeake Bay, the largest estuary in the United States, is twice as high as the global average. It goes on to say the result of the slow-moving catastrophe is that saltwater is threatening America's first colonial farms. Well, it's also threatening our food, right?
Yeah, it is.
It's a big deal.
It is a big deal. I think that, that part about our history going underwater, I think for me is a big reason why I'm motivated to do this research, because I feel very strongly that, we have these historical ties to the land, right. And a lot of the farmers I work with have been able to trace their history back to the 1630s, which are the first families, and their farms are some of the first to be going underwater.
And what do you say to them?
It's tough. I remember a moment where I thought about a lot of the problems I try to solve in my research. So when I was working in East Africa, I was trying to improve the subsistence maize systems. And when I do a lot of cover crop research, it's thinking about the best kind of tools we can use to increase, cover crop adoption. With this problem, it's not entirely solvable. There's not a technical solution to stopping Mother Nature right. to the rising seas, right? So I think a lot about how we might need to incentivize farmers to use different kinds of management practices. So things like, can we incentivize the growing of native marsh plants, and can we pay farmers what would essentially be a living wage to do that, just the way we subsidize cover crops and things like that, because I don't think we're going to be able to farm the crops that we are used to farming. There are some alternatives, like, for instance, quinoa, which is a grain that we often see grown in South America, and it's like pretty high value, but we don't really have the equipment to grow that
and
teeny tiny
everybody
grain.
Under 20 loves it, and everybody over 30 is like, what the heck
what is that?
It?
Right. And also, as we know, the farming industry, or the row crop industry down on the Eastern Shore, is driven by the chicken farm.
Right.
The chicken industry. So we grow our corn, soy, and wheat to feed chickens. And so whatever is being in demand from those industries, there has to be a market demand, a place where a farmer can take his or her crop to market. And so we can't suggest all of a sudden, everyone should just grow quinoa if there's no market for that.
I'm sure the Eastern Shore farmer is going to love to hear that.
Yeah. So there has to be something that can provide them an income. And if that's a crop that can provide them an income, that's great. And if it's not, we need to think about what those strategies are. And
then where would the corn come from?
Well,
higher elevations?
It would come from higher elevations. And we have some land that's still high enough elevation on the Eastern Shore, but we still import a lot of grain actually to feed the chickens on the Eastern Shore.
Okay, native marsh grasses, what's that going to do?
Well, so marsh grasses, we have this big issue with trying to reduce nutrient loading, right, to the Chesapeake Bay. It's huge. The Chesapeake Bay program has been working on this for years. And marshes are a great way, or these native marsh grasses are a great way to trap a lot of nutrients. So that actually could be improving the health of the Chesapeake Bay. So for instance, there's like this sort of indirect impact that it could have on the fisheries, the crab, the industry, because we'd actually be cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay. And then they also are really good at storing carbon. So a big, when we talk about climate resilience, we talk about soil health, which is that there's a huge movement in that right now. The main thing that a lot of people are focusing on is carbon. Like, how do we get our systems to store more carbon? And one of the ways that we can do that is by promoting some of these practices. We have to figure out a way to make it there's a big issue with paperwork. It's just hard. A lot of times it's hard. These incentive programs, we don't make them easy for farmers to enroll in. It's like, they have to do crop insurance and then they have to do their cover crop stuff. And it's like, oh my gosh, now another paperwork. And so we have to come up with ways that we make it really streamlined for farmers. And we have to make sure that we actually know what the heck we're doing.
So how do you go from your brilliant ideas, and they are, to let's make this happen? You talk to the farmers, but there's got to be some other, do you go to the farm bureaus? Do you go to the...
So we try to talk to everybody. I talk to my farmers, and I always make sure we have these sort of roundtable stakeholder meetings with the farmers who we work with every year, and we sort of say, are we on the right track? Does this, the sniff test, does this work for you? Would this work for your, for your other farming, for the farming community? I'm also on the Maryland State Advisory Committee for soil health, and so I know a lot of folks in that realm, and because this has a lot of relevance in terms of carbon storage, climate mitigation. We talk to those people. My biggest partner right now are the folks from NRCS, so the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Yeah, and they're wonderful because they're the folks who come up with the practices that farmers can implement on their farms and the technical support. Like, how do you can't just say, go plant some species of grass you've never planted before. Like, that's not...
Or quinoa.
Yeah, there needs to be seed or bare rootstock. Like, farmers have to know where to get it.
Yeah.
And then they need to know what planting density, right? How to keep it alive. So we've been working really carefully, really closely with the NRCS to try to develop these practices, because we don't want to tell farmers to do anything if it's going to make them go under.
Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back on the 1430 Connection. Welcome back to the 1430 Connection. I'm Donna Cole. In the studio with me today is the brilliant Dr. Kate Tully, an Assistant Professor of Agroecology at the University of Maryland's Department of Plant Science and Landscape Architecture. She's talking about what her research on the Eastern Shore of Maryland and the landward movement of salt water from the ocean, or actually from the bay also, brackish water, into farmland, and how it's going to have devastating consequences for farmers. It already is having devastating consequences. What have you seen?
So we've seen a lot of land loss, especially this is work by my colleague, Dr. Karen Gadan, and she's at George Washington University. So we're all kind of local trying to work on this project.
This is girl power.
It is actually. And our other researcher is Dr. Becky Apanchin-Neal, and she's at Resources for the Future. We have Jared Miller, who is a wonderful soil scientist, and he's at University of Delaware. But there's a lot of girl power in this project. But so Karen and I, she started thinking about trying to understand how fast this is happening, and so we've seen it's about 1,400 acres lost in the last 8 years, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's about 2%. We've lost 2% of our farmland in Somerset County in the last 8 years, which if you think about that, that's quite a lot.
That's one county.
One
Yeah.
county, and if you think about the pace that climate change, at which climate change is increasing, that number could go to 3% in the next 8 years, right? So you could see this accelerating, and so there is on the ground you can see it, and you can also see farms just starting to transition and turn into marshes.
Is there some reticence by the communities that you're speaking to on believing this is happening, or no?
No. I one of the things that I find really fascinating, and I try to do my work, is I want to meet everybody where they're at. So no farmer is going to tell you, oh, I don't have a problem with saltwater intrusion, because they do. They see it on their land, and they'll come to me and they'll say, Kate, I'm seeing this problem on my farm. The point where we disagree is how climate is the cause of climate change. So a lot of the farmers I work with see this as a natural cycle, and whereas I believe that climate change is caused by a lot of human activities. But
that is backed by science.
And that is supported by science. But I don't want to create an argument when I want to help a farmer. So what we try to do is we call it flooding, if that's the term they want to use, and I'm just there to help them solve a problem.
You stay out of politics, is what you're saying.
I do, yeah, because I just want to be there. I want to help them, and I don't want to create any kind of rift.
Okay, in addition to marsh grasses and quinoa, what else should farmers be looking at for the future?
So there's some alternative crops. Barley, actually malting barley. We have a lot of microbreweries that are popping up on the Eastern Shore, and there's some species of malting barley that actually do pretty well. So that could be another crop that we might want to try. Another option for farmers is to, instead of just trying to plant marsh grasses, is actually to abandon the fields entirely, which sounds managed retreat. It sounds counterproductive, but some of the research that we've shown is there's a big concern that Phragmites, which is this huge problem, invasive reed.
I do want to talk to you about that.
We can talk about that. Is going to just take over these farm fields, but actually we're not seeing that happening because the weeds. There's so many agricultural weeds that in that seed bank in the soil, kind of just waiting for their moment. They burst up right after the field is abandoned, and they actually choke out the Phragmites. That's what we're seeing. So
that's interesting,
and that's actually free in a lot of ways, right? So there might even be a way that this kind of concept of managed retreat, which is not to say farmers. That's a really hard sell. Any of these, options are hard sells. Right. But it is actually in many ways the easiest. And if we could, again, incentivize managed retreat, and I would argue maybe a little earlier than they might normally sort of let a piece of land go, because what it can do then is build up all the biomass, all the plants, and that can suck a lot of the nutrients that are in the soil, the phosphorus that we know we have a big phosphorus issue, and put it in the biomass so that when those start to turn into marshes, we don't have a lot of these nutrients being pumped out to the Chesapeake.
How much of that would go? It's not the entire property. It's a small piece of the property? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So, one of the things we're trying to work on now, another woman at the University of Delaware, Dr. Pinky Mundal, she is mapping saltwater intrusion at the field level and actually trying to get a sense of, can we use satellite imagery to pinpoint it? That's not something that's been done before.
Although the seed companies are using it to tell farmers where to seed. I saw recently.
Yeah, right. And so if you see these sort of bad areas, quote unquote bad areas, DuPont or Syngenta or some of these companies will tell you where they think you should and shouldn't try to plant.
So going back to Phragmites.
Yeah.
I was told by the head scientist at Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, it is the only thing that he would want between him and a hurricane. Because it does stop the erosion and the intrusion, right?
So
should we be waging the war that we have for the past 20 years on Phragmites?
That is a great question, and Karen might be an even better person to answer this because she's our plant ecologist. But this is an interesting question because so we have the invasive reed Phragmites, and then we have a native Phragmites. Native Phragmites. Yes, I would say that's a great one to have between us and a hurricane cut. And also it puts on a lot of biomass. It can soak up a lot of nutrients. The problem with the invasive species is that it just chokes everything out. And the habitat value is very low. And I know you've done some research on birds and on, on hunting and so on. And the hunting value of your land plummets when you're, because there's just not a lot of nesting ground. It's not a good, and if you're doing any kind of deer hunting, it's really hard with the invasive species. So the native Phragmites, I would say yes, but probably the invasive species because it's just chokes everything out. Maybe not.
What you're saying isn't just going to help people. What you're suggesting, does have wildlife ramifications too.
Oh, for sure.
Because they depend on this.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So, I mean, again, this is like thinking about those ecosystem services, right? So creating a habitat where we can maintain healthy ecosystems for our ducks and for all, and for other types of wildlife, waterfowl, is really important. And some of these either abandoned managed retreat or even some planted buffer strips are really good nesting grounds for different kinds of bird species. And so that is, another way that we've been trying to pitch this is, to Fish and Wildlife, thinking about, okay, these lands may not be best suited to agriculture anymore. What might be another use for these lands?
So do people look at you as the savior or the enemy, or both?
I think, I don't know if I'm going to be able to save us from the sea, right. but I am trying. I think that people have been willing to work with me because I try very hard to balance farmer needs and what they're willing to do and what they can do financially with the environmental goals of the Chesapeake Bay. And so hopefully I'm seen as, trying to kind of walk this tightrope between the two.
Packed in that genius brain of yours, and that you haven't probably even told anyone yet, are all these great ideas on what's next. So what is next? Let me hear some of your thoughts on
what next?
Your research. Where is it going to go?
Oh, yeah. So we have a lot of different plans, but so one of the things we're doing is we're trying to identify, like I said, different kinds of crops that might be more adapted to the environment. So we have trials down on the Eastern Shore on several different farms. Again, we're mapping, trying to figure out if we can use satellite imagery to figure out where it's happening, because that'll be super helpful for farmers. I'm also working with a team internationally, so this is not just an issue here. It's an issue in Bangladesh and in Vietnam as well. So I'm serving as an advisor on a team that's doing this kind of research in Bangladesh and trying to think about, and that's really has a lot of implications for climate refugees. So does our work as well. We're seeing some of the first climate refugees in the U.S. in our region, but large swaths of land in these low-lying areas in Bangladesh are going to go underwater, and with that, a huge outmigration towards the cities. And so trying to get a handle on saltwater intrusion, not just here, but also globally.
I can't thank you enough for this work that you're doing and for being a guest on the 1430 Connection today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
This is Donna Cole on the 1430 Connection. We'll see you next week.